In the shadowed comfort of my suburban home, scrolling through an app for free stuff, I came across something unusual, a trek bike. High quality, a bit pricey, and in decent condition based on the photos. The listing was simple. Free to good home. Just come pick it up. I didn't need a bike, but there was something oddly appealing about it. My finger hovered over the message button for a beat before I tapped. A reply came almost instantly, which was strange. People offering free items rarely responded that fast. The guy's name was Rick. We exchanged a few messages, mostly small talk, where I was from, why I wanted the bike, all pretty standard. But just as I was expecting a house address or something, he sent a string of numbers, GPS coordinates. Just follow this. It's easier, he messaged. That should have been the first red flag. But it was also intriguing. The curiosity was too much. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? The next Saturday, I decided to make the drive out to the coordinates. It was an overcast day, and the sky seemed unnaturally dark even for the time of year. As I drove further, leaving behind the comfort of populated streets, the scenery changed. Roads narrowed, trees thickened, and there were no houses, just the dense silence of the woods closing in around me. Following the directions, I found a small dirt pull-off. I parked, rechecked the map, and saw that the coordinates led into the forest, about half a mile in. This has to be wrong, I thought. But I couldn't ignore the pull of mystery. Leaving the car behind, I pocketed my phone and set out on foot. The forest was oppressive. Shadows tangled in the branches above, the air heavy with damp leaves and decay. With each step, the ground seemed softer, giving way underfoot like the forest was alive and watching. Rick hadn't replied to my last text, which felt unsettling, but I'd pushed the thought away. I'd only walked 10 minutes in. Turning back would just feel like a waste of time. The deeper I ventured, though, the heavier the silence grew. There were no animal sounds, no rustling leaves, just the echo of my own steps. And then, as I got closer to the location on my GPS, I found nothing. Just trees and thickening shadows. No bike. No Rick. Just emptiness. I pulled out my phone, trying to text again. Hey, I'm here. Where's the bike? I stared at the screen. No answer. I waited a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The forest felt closer, tighter around me. When I tried calling, the line went dead after the first ring. Something was off. Really off. Turning around, I decided to head back, my steps quicker than before. Each snap of a twig behind me made me flinch, though I told myself it was just my imagination. My breathing sped up, heart pounding as my pace quickened through the underbrush. As the clearing came into sight, I almost sighed with relief. My car was right where I'd left it, still visible through the thinning trees. I stepped onto the gravel, fumbling with my keys but froze. All 4 tires were flat. Deep, jagged cuts ran through each one. My heart dropped. But it was only when I saw movement inside the car that the fear solidified. Through the tinted windows, I could just make out a figure, crouched low in the back seat, face obscured. Every instinct screamed for me to run. I turned, bolting back toward the main road. My breath hitched as I dialed 911, barely managing to stammer my location to the operator. I glanced over my shoulder once, catching sight of a shadowy figure slipping out of my car, watching me. The dispatcher kept me on the line, her voice calm and steady. She told me to keep moving, and I clung to her words as I stumbled through the woods, legs numb, lungs burning. Eventually, I heard the blessed sound of sirens, and the sight of flashing lights cutting through the trees brought a rush of relief. The officers found me shaking at the roadside, and as I tried to explain what had happened, they just nodded, faces grim. They didn't seem surprised. One of the officers took my statement, a sympathetic look in his eyes as he asked me about Rick. When I showed him the profile on the app, he frowned. "This isn't the first time we've had calls like this," he said quietly. "We'll take a look, but I wouldn't count on finding this Rick Dot." They escorted me to a local tire shop where my car was towed. As I sat in the shop's waiting area, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure from the back seat, lurking just outside the window. The memory clung to me, haunting my thoughts every time I was alone. A part of me feared he'd track me down, that he'd show up one night. But days turned into weeks, and Rick, or whoever had been out there, never appeared. Yet, sometimes, when I'm out late, a shiver will run down my spine, a reminder of that shadow in the woods, crouched low, watching from the back seat. And I know that, even if he never finds me, he's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow the lure of a free, too-good-to-be-true offer. It was the summer of my 12th year when I first came to understand that some things aren't meant to be discovered, some doors left unopened, and some nights too dark to venture into. That summer, I stayed at my friend's grandmother's house. His name was Elliot, but for the sake of the story, I'll call him Sam. Sam's grandmother, Miss Lillian, was an eccentric woman who lived in a house that was as old as the surrounding town. It creaked and groaned, full of strange whispers when the wind howled through its windows. But Sam had grown up there, and he seemed to have no fear of it. To him, the house was just home. I had arrived at Miss Lillian's house on the evening of the 4th of July. The town had hosted its usual fireworks display, and Sam and I were supposed to spend the night together, playing video games, eating junk food, and staying up far too late. But the evening didn't go as planned. Miss Lillian had prepared a large dinner for us, and afterward she announced that she was going to bed early. Sam and I were left alone in the dining room, which was connected to a dark and seemingly endless backyard, bordered by a dense stretch of woods. The backyard of Miss Lillian's house had always intrigued me, though there was something unnerving about it. It was shrouded in shadows even in the brightest of days, as if the trees themselves hunched closer, watching. That evening, Sam suggested that we play a game of flashlight tag. I had never played such a game before, but I was eager to follow Sam's lead. The idea of running through the darkened backyard, the thrill of hiding among the trees, felt exciting. The game started innocently enough. We ran around the yard, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the thickening evening mist. The old oak tree near the edge of the woods seemed to loom over us, its gnarled roots twisting like fingers reaching from the earth. It wasn't long before I found myself on the far side of the yard, far from the house. I had just spotted Sam, hiding behind the garden shed, when I saw something that made my heart freeze in my chest. Standing motionless among the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, was a figure. At first, I thought it was Sam. He had a tendency to wear an old, faded blanket when we were playing, a relic from his childhood. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure didn't move. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and covered from head to toe in what appeared to be a sheet. The cloth billowed in the wind, its edges fluttering, but there were two distinct holes cut out of it, one for the eyes, one for the mouth. I called out to Sam, but he didn't answer. My heart thumped wildly in my chest, and an unsettling chill ran down my spine. The figure was far too still, far too silent. My first instinct was to laugh it off. After all, this was Sam's house, and maybe he had a prank in mind. But then, something deep inside me screamed that it wasn't a joke. It wasn't Sam. I stumbled back, still keeping my eyes on the figure, and turned to run toward the house. That was when I heard Sam's voice from behind me. "Run!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Get inside, now!" I didn't need another word. I sprinted toward the house, my legs pumping furiously, the sound of my footsteps drowning out everything else. As I reached the porch, I heard the creaking of the front door, followed by the rush of air as Sam appeared beside me, slamming it shut behind us. We locked the door, breathing heavily, both of us standing in the darkened hallway. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, as though it, too, was holding its breath. I turned to Sam, my voice shaking. "Who was that? What was that?" "I don't know," Sam replied, his voice tight. "I thought it was you at first, but then I saw it move." His face paled. "We need to tell Grandma." We found Miss Lillian in the living room, knitting as usual, her sharp eyes never missing a stitch. We told her everything, but instead of reacting with alarm, she simply set down her knitting and stood up slowly. "That's enough of this nonsense," she said firmly, walking over to the door. "Go to your rooms. I'll take care of this." We didn't protest. Sam and I were both too shaken to argue. Miss Lillian had always given us the impression that she was unflappable, but tonight something in her voice made it clear that she wasn't as calm as she seemed. She locked the door behind her, and we retreated to the guest room where I was sleeping. We tried to make sense of what we had seen, but the longer we talked, the more the reality of what had happened settled in. As we lay in bed, the wind began to howl outside, rattling the old windows. I closed my eyes, hoping to drown out the sounds of the storm, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure in the woods. I kept imagining it standing at the edge of the yard, staring through the trees, waiting. Suddenly, there was a loud noise from upstairs, a sound like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Sam and I froze, listening intently. We both thought it was Miss Lillian. After all, she had a habit of pacing around at night, unable to sleep. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved through the house, up and down the stairs, as if searching. We waited, and after a long stretch of silence, I heard Sam's voice, barely a whisper. "Do you think it's her?" "I don't know," I muttered. "Maybe." We lay there, straining to hear, but eventually sleep overcame us. The next morning, the sun shone through the curtains, and I woke with a sense of unease gnawing at me. The house seemed too still, too ordinary. We went downstairs to find Miss Lillian already up, as she always was, making breakfast. However, there was something off about her demeanor that morning. Her face was drawn tight, her eyes scanning the room as if she were searching for something. "I'm afraid something happened last night," Miss Lillian said, her voice low. "Who opened the window in the living room?" Neither Sam nor I had touched the window. We both shook our heads, puzzled. Miss Lillian's expression hardened, and she walked to the living room to investigate. Sam and I followed her. She pointed to the open window. The cold air had rushed in overnight, but that wasn't what bothered her. On the floor, just beneath the window, was a blanket, one that looked like the same one Sam had used earlier that night, but this one was filthy, stained with dark patches. It wasn't just the blanket that caught our attention, though. It was the 3 ragged holes torn into it, just like the ones we had seen on the figure. I could feel the blood drain from my face. Sam's eyes widened in terror as we stared at the blanket. Miss Lillian's hands trembled as she picked it up, holding it at arm's length as if it were contaminated. "We need to leave," she said, her voice urgent. "Now." We didn't question her. Miss Lillian immediately began to gather her things, ushering us toward the door. She was already on the phone with someone, her voice quick and anxious. The next few hours were a blur of motion, Miss Lillian calling the police, the officer arriving to inspect the house. Sam and I huddled together, too terrified to speak. The officer examined the window and the ground outside. He noted that it appeared no one had broken in, and the window had been opened from the inside. The strange thing was that the house had been completely undisturbed, no signs of theft, no evidence of a struggle. Yet the blanket with the holes was irrefutable. After the police left, Sam's grandmother packed a bag and insisted that we leave immediately. She drove us all to her daughter's house, where she stayed for the next few days. The unease never left me, and the image of that figure standing in the woods haunted my dreams. Was it still out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the trees? I never returned to that house again. And to this day, when the wind blows cold and the trees rustle, I remember the figure in the yard. I remember the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the house. And I remember that some things, no matter how much we try to understand them, are better left in the dark. My parents, well, my mother and her new husband, decided to take a long overdue honeymoon, leaving me in the care of Uncle Ronnie. My mom had remarried a year ago, and though the transition had been rough, This seemed like the perfect time for me to retreat to the country and enjoy a quiet respite. Uncle Ronnie lived far away, nestled in the dense woods of East Tennessee, miles from the nearest neighbor. The air there always felt heavy, like the earth was holding its breath. When I first arrived, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Uncle Ronnie was a quiet man, thick around the middle and a bit too fond of his whiskey, but he meant well. He didn't have kids of his own, and I was often his only visitor. The farm had always been his pride, though it felt strange to me, surrounded by fields that stretched on forever, unbroken by houses or roads. He had a small house, really more of a shack, but it was cozy. There was an old wood-burning stove in the kitchen, and a rocking chair in the corner of the living room, where I'd often find him reading the paper or staring off into the distance. One of the most peculiar things about Uncle Ronnie's farm was the scarecrows. He had 3 of them, each positioned at odd points around his property, one near the barn, another by the vegetable garden, and the third standing tall and grim in the middle of an empty field. They were made from tattered old clothes stuffed with hay, their faces drawn with crude, uneven features. The first time I saw them, I had to ask about them. "Why do you need so many scarecrows?" I had asked, staring at the one near the garden, its face twisted in what looked like a permanent sneer. "They keep the crows away," Uncle Ronnie had replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "And sometimes they just look out for the place. You never know who's watching." I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to one of his odd ways of looking at the world. It wasn't until that first night, when the moon hung high in the sky like a watchful eye, that the air began to thicken with something else, something unsettling. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old magazine, the only light coming from the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the night was still, as if even the crickets had taken a break. The old house creaked and groaned as if it was alive, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. I kept hearing sounds from outside, the softest whispers that didn't belong to the wind. I chalked it up to the isolation, but something gnawed at me. Then it happened. A stone hit the window with a sharp crack, the sound splitting through the stillness like a sudden scream. My heart leapt into my throat, and I jumped up from the couch, my pulse racing. I stared at the window for a long moment, but there was nothing. Nothing but the faint glow of the moon casting shadows across the yard. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. I'd smoked a joint earlier, maybe too much, and the feeling of paranoia wasn't exactly unfamiliar. Still, the rock had hit with too much force, and the timing had been too perfect. I approached the window cautiously and pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. At first, I thought I was imagining things. One of the scarecrows near the barn, the one with the red shirt, was moving. Not much, just a slight sway, like it had caught the breeze. But no, I was sure now. It was waving. Waving at me. The arm was outstretched in a slow, deliberate gesture. I blinked hard, trying to focus. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe I was just seeing things because of the weed. But no, the arm didn't move like the wind would have made it move. It was a purposeful wave. My breath caught in my throat. No, this couldn't be happening. It was impossible. I looked away for a moment, trying to shake the image from my mind. When I looked back, the scarecrow was still there, but its arm had lowered, and its face seemed to turn, just slightly, as if it was watching me. My stomach twisted into a tight knot, and I stepped back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed up, staring at the shadows cast by the lamplight, listening to the sounds of the night, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves outside, but no more stones, no more movements. The next morning, I could still feel the unease, lingering in the pit of my stomach like a bad taste. Uncle Ronnie didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He was up early, as usual, feeding the chickens and checking on his crops. It wasn't until later in the afternoon, when we were walking toward the barn, that he mentioned the scarecrows. "Something strange happened last night," he said, scratching his stubbled chin. 3 of them are gone. Vanished. Don't know where they went. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't said anything to him about what I'd seen the night before, but I wondered now if he'd noticed something too. I'm sure they'll turn up, he added, clearly unconcerned. Those old scarecrows have a way of moving around, just like everything else on this place. He laughed, but it was forced, as if he was trying to convince himself more than me. We spent the rest of the day looking for the scarecrows, but there was no sign of them. It was as if they had simply disappeared. The whole thing felt wrong, like some dark omen was hanging over the place. That night, though, something even worse happened. I was standing on the porch, looking out at the field, when I saw them. The scarecrows had returned. But they were no longer in their usual spots. They stood at the edge of the porch, lined up in front of the house, their bodies stiff and still, and their faces, those hideous, malformed faces, were painted with something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I stepped closer, my blood ran cold. The scarecrows were covered in what looked like blood. Thick, sticky, crimson streaks ran down their bodies, pooling around their feet like puddles of gore. I froze, my mind racing. The moonlight glinted off the red stains, making them shine with a sickly sheen. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I turned to Uncle Ronnie, who was standing just inside the door, his face pale and drawn. He saw the scarecrows too, his eyes widening with disbelief. Who would do something like this? I whispered, my voice trembling. Damned kids, probably, he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Halloween's coming up, they probably thought it'd be funny. I didn't believe him, not for a second. There was something far darker at play here, something I couldn't explain. We tried to clean up the scarecrows, but the red stains wouldn't come off. It was as if the blood had been soaked into their very fabric, like they were part of something ancient, something malevolent. Even when we tried to wash them in the creek, the red remained, as though mocking us. As I lay in bed that night, I kept hearing noises outside, faint whispers carried on the wind. I kept my eyes closed, trying to block out the thoughts that were flooding my mind. But I couldn't. I kept seeing the scarecrows, standing like sentinels in the moonlight, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. I could still feel their eyes on me, watching. It was a Friday night. The kind of night that made everything seem still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I was 16, and the thrill of being young had a certain edge to it, an edge that made it impossible to resist the call of the dark streets and the empty roads that stretched out before us. Jackson, Roddy, and I had been riding our bikes through town for weeks, each time a little bolder, a little further, chasing the fading echoes of summer and the whisper of adventures only the night could offer. We weren't supposed to be out this late, but nobody cared. In the small town of Riverton, the dark felt like home, even if it hid the things you weren't meant to see. That night, the air was heavy with anticipation, as if something was about to happen, though none of us could name it. We had made our way to Main Street, our tires humming softly on the cracked pavement, the only sound besides the occasional creak of the streetlights. It was close to midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of the leaves in the wind. I remember the chill that began to settle into my bones, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was nothing, just the usual unease that came with being out at night. We stopped in the parking lot of an old, abandoned convenience store that no one had bothered to tear down yet. The building was a forgotten relic, its windows boarded up, graffiti scrawled on the walls in a language no one cared to understand. We leaned our bikes against the cracked asphalt and sat on the hood of a rusted car, the only other thing left in the parking lot besides the smell of dust and gasoline. That's when we saw it. A car, black and sleek, came to a sudden stop in the lot across from us. The engine died, leaving only the hum of the streetlights overhead. It was strange. No one came to this part of town, especially not at this hour. And yet there it was, sitting silently like a predator watching its prey. We froze, all three of us. The lights from the car reflected off the glass windows of the abandoned store, casting long, jagged shadows across the parking lot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the driver's side window rolled down, and a figure appeared in the darkness. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, staring at us. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, on us. Jackson shifted uncomfortably, and I could see Roddy tense up beside me. Neither of them said a word, but I could tell we all felt it, the unsettling sensation that something was terribly wrong. "Let's go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Without waiting for a reply, I grabbed my bike and started pedaling, the others close behind. We didn't look back as we sped through the empty streets, the tires of our bikes squealing against the pavement. I don't know how far we had gone before I realized the car was following us. The sound of its engine was low but persistent, almost like a shadow trailing just behind us. The adrenaline surged in my veins. My heart raced as we pushed ourselves faster, my legs burning with every pedal stroke. But no matter how fast we went, the car stayed with us, never getting any closer, but never falling behind either. It was like it was waiting, like it knew exactly where we were headed, like it was part of the night itself. We turned off Main Street and onto the quieter residential roads, heading toward my house. My heart was pounding, but a part of me felt a strange relief. At least I would be safe inside my house, away from whatever it was that followed us. Or so I thought. As we pulled into the driveway, I glanced over my shoulder. The car was still there, stopped at the end of the street. The headlights were off now, but I could feel the weight of its gaze on us, as if the man was still watching, waiting for something. I didn't look for too long. I couldn't. I had to get inside. "Stay close," I muttered to Jackson and Roddy as we hurried toward the backyard. We all rushed to the back door, and I didn't pause to check if anyone was still out there. My mind was racing, the fear and confusion clouding my thoughts. My dad was a heavy sleeper, but I still knocked on his bedroom door, my voice shaky as I tried to explain what had happened. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone's been following us. There's a car parked down the street. I think it's watching the house." He grumbled something about needing his sleep and told me everything was fine. But I could hear the unease in his voice, the way he hesitated for just a second too long before telling me to go back to bed. I didn't argue. I knew better than to push him when he was in one of his moods, so I went back to my room and lay there in the dark, wide awake. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the man in the car had probably been nothing more than some drunk looking for trouble. But as I lay there, my mind kept drifting back to those eyes, the way they had fixed on us in that parking lot, cold and unblinking. It wasn't long before I heard it. A faint noise coming from the backyard. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling in the night. But then I heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Klitch, klitch, klitch. It was coming from the direction of the shed. I knew what it sounded like, someone trying to open the shed door. My heart skipped a beat. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up in bed, my eyes wide and searching the darkness. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The noise came again, louder now, more insistent. Klitch, klitch, klitch. I grabbed my phone and texted Jackson and Roddy, but neither of them replied. I could hear them both still out in the yard, but the tapping grew louder, and it was coming closer. I couldn't just lie there. I had to do something. I crept out of bed and tiptoed over to the window, trying to peer through the blinds. My eyes scanned the backyard, and I saw it. The shed door was cracked open. But there was no one standing there. I pulled away from the window, my body frozen in fear. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of it all. My first instinct was to run to my dad, to wake him up and tell him what was going on. But the thought of him telling me it was nothing, or worse, the possibility that I had imagined it, kept me still. I had to check for myself. I tiptoed out of my room, careful not to wake anyone. I reached the back door and opened it as quietly as I could, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. The tapping had stopped, but I knew it wouldn't be long before it started again. The shed loomed in the darkness, its outline barely visible under the dim light from the back porch. I crept toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was still cracked, and as I reached out to push it open, I felt something cold against my hand. It was metal, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin and made your bones ache. Suddenly, the door flung open, and I staggered backward in shock. There was nothing inside. Nothing but the broken lock and the faint scent of something foul, like wet earth and something else, something I couldn't quite place. But I could feel it then, like a presence in the dark, watching me. I ran back to the house as fast as I could, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. I slammed the back door shut behind me and locked it. My heart was racing, my mind spinning, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just been alone in the yard. That night, my father called the police. They came early in the morning, combing the yard, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. But they found nothing. The shed was undisturbed, the broken lock was a mystery, and the car, the one that had followed us, was gone. The officer who came to speak to us said it was probably just some kids messing around. But I knew better. I could feel it, deep in my gut, that something was wrong. A chill settled into the forest as November cast its long shadows over the woods. I never would have thought that an innocent camping trip would become a haunting memory I'd carry for the rest of my life, but here I am, recounting it to you. Her name was Lena, my girlfriend of nearly 2 years. That night, we camped near her father's remote cabin in the dense woods of northern Minnesota. The forest was familiar to her. She'd grown up around it, she said. The creeks and the endless maze of pines were like family, she said. I, on the other hand, felt only the unease that comes with isolation, as if the trees were too close, their shadows too long. The afternoon had slipped into evening, and as we sat by the campfire, its flickering warmth surrounded us. Lena was telling me about childhood games she used to play here, games of hide-and-seek with her brothers, stories they'd make up about the creatures that lurked just beyond the trees. We laughed, and I found myself relaxing, lulled by her laughter and the crackling of the fire. Then, something caught our attention. A faint sound, like the crunching of dry leaves underfoot, echoed from the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, peering into the darkness. Just past the light's reach, a shadow seemed to move. Lena's laughter died, and she turned to look, her eyes squinting as if trying to focus. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded slowly. "Maybe a deer," she muttered, but I could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Still, the sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed just a few feet from us. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. We both waited, eyes fixed on the darkness. I don't know why, but I glanced at the empty camp chair we'd brought, the one we'd left unoccupied by the fire. And that's when I saw it, a dark figure sitting there, hunched over as though it had been with us all along. I could make out the vague outline of shoulders, a head, and arms folded over the knees. The fire's light cast an eerie glow over the empty face. "Lena," I whispered, barely daring to move. "Do you see that?" Her eyes followed my gaze. She froze, and I felt her grip tighten on my arm. Neither of us spoke, either of us dared breathe as the figure sat unmoving, staring into the fire. I don't know how long we sat there, staring. Maybe it was a second, maybe an hour. Time felt twisted, stretched thin as spider silk. But at last, the spell broke, and I reached for the flashlight beside me, determined to shatter the illusion. With a sharp click, the beam of light cut through the darkness, aimed directly at the chair. Nothing. The chair was empty, just as it had been moments ago. The air was still, and all I heard was the low crackling of the fire, and the pounding of my own heart. I turned off the flashlight, swallowing back a shaky breath, and looked at Lena. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Let's go inside," she whispered. We quickly doused the fire and stumbled into the tent, zipping it shut behind us as if that thin layer of fabric could shield us from whatever was lurking outside. But the moment we were inside, another chilling realization struck us. The shadow had returned. Through the thin walls of the tent, cast by the pale glow of moonlight, we could see it, a dark, human-like shape sitting in the exact same spot, its head slightly bowed as if watching us. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. Yet there it was, unmoving and silent, but undeniably there. Lena's breathing grew rapid, and I felt my own heart racing. "It's just the shadows," I tried to tell her, but even I didn't believe my own words. We both knew that shadows don't appear without something to cast them. We had to get out of there. Lena grabbed my hand, and together we scrambled out of the tent, abandoning everything but ourselves as we bolted toward her father's cabin. The darkness seemed to close in around us, thick with an oppressive silence. But as we ran, the silence was suddenly broken by something else. A low, guttural moan that rose from the depths of the forest, followed by the sharp crack of branches snapping as if something enormous were moving through the woods, following us. I don't remember how long we ran. All I remember is the burning in my lungs, the terror coursing through my veins, and Lena's grip on my hand, so tight it felt like she was the only thing keeping me grounded to reality. We reached the cabin and slammed the door behind us, bolting it shut before collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. For a long while, we just lay there, staring at each other, either of us daring to speak, as if acknowledging what had just happened might make it real. Finally, I managed to find my voice. What the hell was that?" I whispered. She shook her head, her face as pale as a ghost. "I don't know. But I don't think it's gone." And she was right. Outside, just beyond the door, we could still hear it, a faint rustling, like leaves being crushed underfoot, and an intermittent creaking, like the sound of old wood bending under weight. Whatever it was still there, waiting. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too terrified to sleep, every creak and groan of the cabin's old wooden frame twisting our nerves tighter. Eventually, the sounds faded with the dawn, but the fear didn't leave us. When the first light of morning spilled through the windows, we dared to venture outside, still clutching each other like lifelines. The campsite was empty, silent as if nothing had happened. But as we approached the spot where we had been sitting, we saw the chair lying on its side, as though someone had knocked it over. It was the only sign, the only evidence that anything out of the ordinary had happened. We never went camping again after that night. We left the woods behind, but that shadow, its dark, silent presence, has haunted me ever since. Even now, sometimes in the dead of night, I wake to the sound of leaves crunching outside my window, and for a split second, I feel like I'm back in those woods, staring at that empty chair, wondering what unseen eyes might be watching.